All right. Joining us now is New York Times journalist and reporter Richard Fausset. First of all, thank you, Richard, for being here to chat with us.
It's great to be here.
Yeah. To sort of set the stage and give us a launching point, obviously we know that you write about, among other things, conservative culture and Trump, and those are things that we are sort of endlessly fascinated with here. And you, as you also know, Michaela and I became aware of you and your work through the interview you gave with the STAC director at Brock University. And I think what really piqued our interest in that was this point where you talked about political polarization as an effect of sort of the new social media landscape and sort of big data and algorithms and the way those feed and reward epistemic bubbles and create these sort of echo chambers, right, where it drives engagement, and so there's an inherent sort of incentive to create those echo chambers at the expense of sort of cross partisan discourse that's productive. And I think that's important, and I think that is sort of like an evergreen thing to talk about. But I think in some ways, with Trump's second term, it's kind of become not like a bit of a banal observation, and I think it focuses a little too much on the content over the form, in the sense that clearly the Republicans and the right broadly since Trump's second term are profiting off of the current social media landscape far more than their political rivals. Like in my mind, nothing is more emblematic of that shift than sort of what I call the four horsemen of the big tech apocalypse, and like Sam Altman, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Jeff Bezos all being at his inauguration. They all supported his campaign in one way or another. Obviously, we know Musk with Doge actually was like a part of not only the campaign but his administration. So I guess my question to start us off is, have you noticed this sort of allyship and synergy between the Republicans and the right and the major power players in big tech? And if so, what do you think accounts for it?
Well, first of all, it's so nice to be here. I think you've laid out some of the issues that we're going to talk about so well that I feel like I can just kind of kick back and just listen. So thank you for doing already a
We
lot
do
of
good work here, Richard.
that. Yeah. I guess if the question is, was it? I mean, I don't have a lot of insight into the hows and the whys of the big tech giants and their leaders getting behind President Trump. And I don't even know at this point, and maybe you guys know, whether or not this means down the road, meaning in the next 4, 8, 12, 16, 20 years, that this will mean that we're going to see like a kind of algorithmic modification that will benefit whoever's in power in the White House. I think a lot of that hinges on the power of the executive branch going forward. It seems to me that the executive branch of the United States, certainly under Trump Part 2, is seeking to consolidate power, to add to its power, and to sort of, in some ways, supersede the system of checks and balances that we had among the three branches of government. I think it strikes me as almost a fait accompli that if you have an executive branch that over the next few years and perhaps over the next few decades just continues to grow and grow in power, that you'll see more very large corporations seeking to curry favor with them in much more extreme ways. I don't know if that answers your question, but it just seems like that's kind of possibly. I'm sorry. It seems that perhaps what we saw recently with the four horsemen is the beginning of something. I'm not sure if it's the beginning of
Right.
something, but you could see how it could be the beginning of something.
Right. And is that the allure of power in just noting that, okay, the executive branch has been consolidating its power more in a more accelerated way when there's Republican administrations, I'd note, and just saying this is advantageous for our business, or is it more systemic? Like, are these platforms going to always sort of appeal to whoever has that power and whoever's looking to consolidate that sort of unilateral governance power? Does that make sense?
I think so. I mean, I guess I don't know if this is a direct answer to your question, but it strikes me that the something central to the nature of Trump and Trumpism is the fact that everything's personal. Everything works through me. It's almost like these when you hear about, ancient kings opening up the doors to the people once a month, and you know, two farmers come in, and one says, "Well, this guy has taken 30 of my sheep," and this question of 30 sheep becomes something that's not delegated out by a bureaucracy that is a bit more faceless and maybe a bit more technocratic. But it's the king himself who decides, okay, well, you take 15 of those sheep, you put the other three on the spit to appease the gods, because I've said it and I'm the king. And I think this is kind of the way President Trump sees the world, is a world of interpersonal deals. And I think that's how he sees government. And I think we're seeing right now, at least in the executive branch, a a government by personality and government by personal relationship, as opposed to government by system, which sounds sort of faceless, but I think that's the way it worked for a really long time. Someone from the the Federal Trade Commission is going to come out and see you at your office, and now perhaps with the way it's this president wants to see people courting him, a very different model emerge.
And just building off of how you mentioned that the sort of the Trump and Make America Great Again movement, it's very individualistic. Do we what is the degree to which we think that is kind of built out of this digital landscape where there's so much polarization online, and it does really target one's identity in relation to politics?
Oh gosh, that's such a great question. I mean, I'm really interested in the ways in which people in this country right now are responding not only to policy prescriptions, and I think there are very real reasons why the Trump campaign's policy prescriptions were popular. I don't want to discount those. I think people were really worried about the border crisis, and I think people were really worried about prices at the grocery store. And I think people, at least some degree of people, were really worried about the issue of trans people in amateur sports. So those I think were really very very real issues. But I also think there's a way in which in the United States our politics are very sort of culturally based. That if you're, and you can feel that quite a bit here in the South where I live. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and for many years I exclusively just covered the southern states, which, as you guys know, are for the most part very conservative. Right. And it's a kind of tribalism, and I think people on the left display this as well. There's certain retailers that people on the left go to that they don't go to on the right as much, and vice versa. The way and I think it's a really interesting question. I wonder what you guys think as outsiders. Outsiders just meaning that you're just right across the border. I mean, do you feel like President Trump has somehow tapped into this sense that politics is more than just policy, that it is it has something to do with an interpersonal connection? I mean, on that note, and I find this really interesting. I never watched his show, The Apprentice. Did you guys ever watch it?
No.
No, I never. Well, I feel really bad. I never watched it, and I think it's been a real problem for me, and I think for a lot of people who are trying to understand Trumpism at when it was kind of happening. This guy was on television, I think every weeknight or like Monday through Thursday or something. It wasn't just like a TV special, and he'd show up every quarter or every month or something, or just once a week. He's constantly on television. And like much of so-called reality television, he's playing a sort of fictionalized version of himself. And this persona, I think, which very much runs counter to his persona in the business realm, which has been, I think it's fair to say it's been quite mixed. It was this persona which people connected to. And television is such an intimate medium. I think it's kind of on the way out. My kids don't really watch it anymore, and perhaps watching something on a phone is even more intimate. But I think to Trump's credit, he really understood inherently or intellectually or something, that this persona that he created was very powerful, and that it was this persona that connected with people. This fantastic businessman who could solve all these problems, who could be a great decider, who knew so much more than anyone knew. And I think it's, in some ways it's this connection to the persona as opposed to this connection to Trump himself that people have really fallen for.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I don't even think this is necessarily disagreement to note, but I do also think there's something about like historical context of that persona working that's interesting, because I think as much as we personalize Trump, and like certainly I think we need to focus on the mechanics of like his personality in terms of understanding the new right broadly and sort of MAGA populism, if you want to call it that. I mean, when we look across the pond at like the UK and sort of Brexit, for example, I mean, it seems to run on a similar logic of like the sort, let's call it the like manufacturing base of this country has sort of hollowed out as capitals, has taken flight in the last few decades. There's sort of an aggrieved set of like the working class sort of has this set of aggrievements, and that seems to be a ripe situation to sort of harness those feelings and like turn them on the other as opposed to the actual problem, which is usually material and has to do with sort of these broader systems of like production and distribution. So it's easier to like point to, for example, the immigrant as like the cause of all your problems, like, and they're coming and they're taking your jobs, as opposed to, well, what about the broader sort of dynamic that's taken place sociopolitically that's oftentimes very like transnational, right? So I wonder if like, yes, focusing on Trump and the personality of Trump is important to understanding the new right, but also these broader shifts seem to be indicative of something more. So there's
Yep.
more of an issue at a systemic level.
Oh yeah, no, I hate them. I think you're 100% correct. And you had mentioned that I'd spoken to a group of students a few months ago. I think that was when I was in Paris doing just a few months of work there. And it's really interesting being in France after the election of Donald Trump in the U.S. I think years, excuse me, decades ago, the French would have had a very different kind of. I would have had a lot of different kind of dinner party conversations in Paris. Along the lines of what's wrong with you, meatheads on the other side of the pond. Now everyone's in the same boat, and I really wonder exactly what those reasons are. Why are we seeing this in Hungary? Why are we seeing it in France? Why are we seeing it in the UK? Some iteration of it, as you noted. Why are we seeing some iteration of it in Brazil? It
Right.
didn't quite
Bolsonaro,
work.
yeah.
Yeah, it didn't quite work in Canada, in part just because Trump decided that he was going to annex you. But it's like, or whatever. But like, it's it raises a really good question, and so and that is it just sort of the failures of globalism, the failures of neoliberal, so-called neoliberal support for globalism, that is the reason why you have all of these French towns that were communist, for many decades, that are now 100% in favor of the Rassemblement National, that used to be called the National Front, the far right party there. Is it the fact that small L, or whatever, a liberal, classically liberal economics to some extent didn't really help people enough in East Germany, and they're now supporting the Alliance for Deutschland. I mean,
Right.
I don't quite understand all the reasons why, but certainly something is broken. Certainly there is a massive amount of discontent when it comes to sort of this sort of squishy idea of globalism in general. And it's interesting that the two aspects of globalism. I mean, one is just like extremely open markets and relatively free market conditions that have allowed people to buy South Korean televisions in Marseille and to buy French wine in Wisconsin, or whatever, or to have a car that's manufactured in your country and in our country and in Mexico and partially in Germany. somehow that's all made people very unhappy, and that they feel like their standard of living hasn't risen, even when in some cases, in the United States at least, there's data that suggests that it has. And then the other piece of this, and this is where I guess I would, again, not disagreeing with you, Hatham, but I think just sort of pushing back gently against the idea of immigration and the scapegoating of the other. You know, the 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 we're living in a changing country in the United States when it comes to immigration. Certainly, Canada has been transformed by these changes. Certainly, a country like France, a country like Germany, they're being transformed by these changes. And Europe, particularly, this it was, I think it was 2015, 2016, where we saw this really mass wave of immigration that they're still trying to deal with. And I think whether they're right or wrong, there are a lot of people who are being told to be afraid of these things, and there are a lot of people who inherently feel uncomfortable about these things. The fact that their culture is changing underneath their feet, or at least that's what they think, and the fact that this new way that NAFTA was just one of the I think just one of the kind of key moments in this kind of post World War II movement in favor of global trade has just left a lot of people feeling kind of empty. And I would love to ask you guys as Canadians what your take is on that. I mean, do you think that explains this? I mean, you have some iteration of it in Canada, right? Or is it
Yeah.
is it something else or other things as well?
Michaela, did you want to go, or I
Um,
have a lot of thoughts on this?
you go ahead and share yours first. Let me cultivate
Okay.
some a little bit. Yeah.
I think so. Here it's interesting because definitely there's been a lot of noise about immigration, and in some ways, it's absolutely correct that immigration has caused a lot of issues here, but
Hmm.
it's completely because of a constraint on infrastructure that has not been adequately invested in to take on that level of immigration.
Hmm.
So it's interesting, like you have sort of the neoliberal movement happen, and suddenly the government is sort of like, we have a hands-off approach, a laissez-faire approach. We're going to let the market do its thing. And unlike, in the post-war era where there was massive investment in housing, in education, in all these infrastructures that would support and invite, I think, a lot more human capital and flow of people, and it did. This laying off approach has sort of led to a lack of funding in the specific places where
Hmm.
immigrants would fall in the society, right? When you have the free market, which around here tends to just move towards in terms of housing, developing like single family homes that no one can buy, and that BlackRock or Vanguard buys up to sell it
Yeah.
at their profit. And with education, tuition is just going up, and faculty, like teaching faculty at universities, are being outnumbered by administrators like 3 to 1 in some circumstances.
Hmm.
You're just seeing a sort of lack of direct like investment in that infrastructure, and then people are frustrated, rightfully, with the fact that they feel, okay, we've allowed in so many immigrants in the last 10 years. Our Liberal Party has allowed in millions of immigrants, but it has nothing to do really with, like, it gets personalized and turned into like fear of culture and fear of loss of sort of the identity of Canada. But I mean, you can challenge that, I think, here as well as in the United States, because in the United States, I mean, we're settler colonial societies, right? We started off as immigrants. So
Yeah.
what is this identity? And I think it's often a dog whistle when people say that. And what they really mean is sort of a kind of whiteness, or a kind of yeah, I think it's honestly, there's a lot of like sort of white supremacist um, corollaries to saying like the national identity of Canada is being threatened. I think it's completely a lack of material investment in these areas.
Well, as somebody who's a white person who grew up in the South of the U.S., who's very you who's always been very sensitive to these. I guess you'd call them identitarian issues. I think that's essentially what the KKK comes down to. It's a nice kind of antiseptic way to talk about a really nasty bundle of sentiments. I'm I also think it's worth sort of pondering where whether there's anything to this kind of concern. Well, we used to be this way, and now we're becoming this. And I feel bad for people who are seeing something like demographic change, and they I don't agree with them, but I feel like it's part of my job to try to understand how they feel.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, my wife and I watched a few episodes of the Canadian show Kim's Convenience, which I think did a. Have you guys seen that show? And which
Yeah.
to me, I was like, well, this is fantastic. Like, this is Canada, which is growing and changing, and it's this country that it's certainly the bumps along the way are what makes the drama, but you have this kind of this kind of beautiful thing where you have people from all over the world who are sort of coming together because this is where they want to be. This is where they think they can raise their children. And I'm interested in the way all that works. And I guess I've never felt particularly threatened by it. I've always felt more interested in it. And then again, maybe this comes from a place of privilege. Maybe this is just this kind of like bougie way of saying, oh, well, my son and I just went out to Buford Highway here in Atlanta, which has it's this strip of just intensely multicultural restaurants and grocery stores, and we had tacos as good as the ones you'd eat in Mexico City, in a region that really wasn't known for its Mexican migration, except for sort of briefly, I think, earlier in the 20th century, and now all that's changed. I also remember doing some reporting in the city of Nashville many years ago when I was working for the Los Angeles Times, and I'll never forget this anecdote. I was, or this little just moment in my life. I was writing about how Nashville was thinking about passing an English language only ordinance. They would insist that all your signs had to be in English. This this, that, and the other language had to be in English. And Nashville, is in the heart of the interior American South. Since forever, I mean, it had been Anglo people, white people, black people, Native American people, and that was it, really. I mean, there were some, marginally, demographically, there were some other people. But starting, I think, around the 90s, you saw all this change. The largest, I may be wrong about this, but I think at the time they were having the largest Iraqi elections outside of Iraq because refugee groups had brought in thousands upon thousands of Kurds. There was a huge West African population there. All these cultures had come to Nashville, and to me, it just made Nashville more interesting. All right, well, let's see what happens when you have Somali refugees listening to George Jones records, and what happens next. It could be great. But I remember being in a repair shop in a place, I think it was called Nolansville Pike in Nashville. And the guy, a white guy, I interviewed him, and he just talked about how all the signs had changed, and he didn't understand what they meant anymore because they were in Amharic or because they were in Spanish or whatever. And I think it's really, in some ways, theoretically for the States, I guess to some extent for Canada, it's like we're not nations that are sort of we're theoretically we're meant to be open to everybody. I don't know. I don't know what happens next as we continue to see this kind of intensely plural world kind of being born around us.
Yeah.
If that sense of just wanting to stand athwart it and yell stop is what wins the day.
And I feel like this is a very relevant conversation right now. I mean, even shifting back to America, we're seeing the Trump administration had just recently threatened Harvard's eligibility to enroll international students. And I think that's really what we're talking about is really relevant to our earlier conversation as well, is whether or not the MAGA movement is it representative of like these underlying concerns within the right, or is it pulling on the threat of one's identity or even like American identity being sort of invaded?
It's such a great question. I mean, I apologize because I don't know. Is the dynamic the same in Canada? Do the conservatives sort of have the same level, bring the same level xenophobia or anti-immigrant sentiment as the modern day Republicans do here in the States?
I think perhaps to not as extreme levels. Like I think we're
Yeah.
seeing with the Canadian right, there's less of a like a social media presence in the same way that Trump and those around him have. But there is definitely you can see hints of the same sentiment between the two.
Interesting. I mean, I was having maybe this is neither here nor there, but I remember having dinner with a British colleague who was defending the monarchy and defending it in the following way, which I thought was interesting. That for the job of sort of standing in for the people who represent us as a people, we have these whatever these people who we call the king and the queen and the duke of this and the duchess of that and blah blah blah, and it serves a very important function because all the all this sort of idea of incarnating the populace and standing for the thing and being the symbol of all that is right and is good and everything that we wish our country to be, we farm that out to these guys and they do that stuff and they sit in the palace and that's their job. And that in some ways allows us to not have to treat our politicians like that at all. That we just, everybody's a, insert very spicy British word for someone you don't think very highly of. We think of them all that way. We don't really inject this sense of like importance and grandeur, and you represent the great, the country and our aspirations and blah blah blah. We don't imbue them with any of that stuff. We just say like you're the joker who is running things right now. We're going to throw you out next week if we don't like you, and it's very very healthy. It's like I'm an American, so I'm an anti-monarchist. So that's kind of the reason why our country exists. So,
That's our way.
so I mean,
Not
yeah, so I was
Canadians
like,
necessarily, but
yeah, but I was like, well, this guy's kind of won me over with this idea. I mean, the fact that we have, this person, this president who's supposed to incarnate all that is good, all that we aspire to, who's supposed to lead us in this almost kind of spiritual way. Plus, he's got to like propose a budget to Congress every year. It's just like kind of a mess. And I wonder, I mean, Canadian politics, in some ways, it seems like there have been these, and again, I'm so ignorant about Canadian politics. I wish I knew more, but it seems like you kind of have these spasms of like kind of glomming on to a personality. It seems like in every case they're named Trudeau, and that doesn't always last. But I mean, I wonder though if you think, it's just the way American politics works. I mean, there are people who follow the policies, and then and maybe this is the way politics is around the world. But then, the president particularly has to stand for something more. You have to like that person. You have to be able to feel okay about having a beer with that person, which is what everybody said about
right.
George W. Bush. Well, it's easier to have a beer with George W. Bush. And I wonder where you think Canada falls along that line. If you accept my friend's contention that, well, in England, we don't really imbue them with any special powers. We just want them to like do the job of governing, versus the United States, which is like a shining city on a hill, and this is the great avatar. And I'm sure you've seen the paintings of Trump, riding with Jesus on on an F-16 or whatever, with Abraham Lincoln behind him and an eagle. So where do you think Canada is between those two poles?
Well, I mean, obviously we still have some ties to the Commonwealth, but that's greatly diminished in like the last few decades. Like since the 1980s, we got our own charter. I mean, I guess to your friend's contention, like I see how that makes sense in a kind of almost like psychodynamic way, but I feel like it's important for the sort of figurehead, symbolic, spiritual state figurehead, whatever you want to call it, to not be vested with any real power for that to work. And sure, I think it can be like a cultural icon to sort of rally around and create cohesion. But I almost, what worries me is like Trump seems to almost be attempting to be both of those things, like the politician who actually has power, but also that figurehead to rally around, and it seems to be working, right? So like it almost seems like his attempts to consolidate the executive branch, his suspending civil rights, suspending due process. I mean, his administration is talking about doing away with like basic, like habeas corpus, right?
Yeah.
Like it seems to me that that is like a very double-edged sword to keep alive in a sort of body politic where you sort of do just like almost like you there's a certain excitement about or like acceptance is a better word of the alienation of like okay, this person has just symbolic power and like symbolic spiritual power, and so we sort of just delegate to their every whim and belief. I mean, that's why I think we're seeing so much of like a kind of non-intellectual sycophantic discourse around MAGA. So that's where I get worried about this like sort of being comfortable with the state figurehead ideal, that kind of Hegelian ideal. I don't know if that answers
And
the question, but
just to build off that as well, I know, Richard, you were asking about how our political landscape compares to America in that way. And the biggest comparison I can find recently is that when Trudeau was widely disliked and unpopular, we did see Pierre Poilievre, who's the leader of the Conservative Party, kind of swoop in and try to be that heroic figure, though he did lose in the election. It was very close.
Yeah.
But interestingly, when he did embody that, or attempted that sort of populist approach, he was accused of just trying to be like Donald Trump and just inspiring his whole campaign around Donald Trump. And that is a big reason why he lost some support trajectory ahead of the election, was because of the impending trade war with Trump. It was because the two figures seem too similar. So I think that's why we find Trump so fascinating, because he is kind of this, like Hatham was saying, he's kind of playing both sides of this, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't. I didn't see this coming. That Donald Trump, who had talked for many many years about running for president, that he would be successful, and I think there are wiser people than I have done a great job of trying to think this through. But to me, there's something about the transgressive nature of Donald Trump's language that I think is very powerful to people. I think for many, many years, at least in my lifetime, I was born in 1970, and I think the Cold War was happening, and there was a sense that language always had to be carefully calibrated. That that our diplomatic corps had to carefully calibrate their language because we were teetering on the brink of nuclear annihilation for forever. And I think that carried on beyond the Cold War. And I think maybe it's the way politics has just always been done here for a really long time, that people have spoken a language in Washington and spoken a language on the news and spoken a language when they are in a debate that tries to really consider all of the potential ramifications of the saying of a thing. We had a president who talked about an axis of evil that didn't exist, and I think that was a good example of language that could be, kind of that there are consequences for language that's not particularly precise and not particularly thoughtful. But Trump just shows up and he just says whatever's on his mind at the time. He doesn't really think about calibrating anything.
yeah,
And I think this is the way most people talk. I think this is the way most people who are drinking beers in a bar talk. Well, that guy's an asshole. And you know what we should do? We should just nuke him off the face of the earth. And, I think this was one piece of what made Trump really, really successful and really powerful. But there are other parts that sort of baffle me. So I don't know. I don't know what you guys how you guys see it.
yeah. You're reminding me of a really great book that I read a few years ago called "Kill All Normies" by Angela Nagel, and it's her argument is basically that what we see in like Trumpism is almost the counterculture kind of sentiment that you got from like the May '68 generation, but in a right sort of framework. this sense of irreverence, the sense of being against sort of the status quo, and the status quo being sort of these like soft liberals, identity politics type people on campuses. And so it does seem like I think that's true, and I think that that sort of lack of care in the way he talks does resonate with people. And I think this is, from my opinion, is that this is something that sort of the Democratic elite has played a huge part in by being so focused on what I would call like the polite face of politics without actually listening to the concerns of like working class people. And I think it's a kind of alienating type of discourse in some places. I mean, even just being at a university, I've certainly seen types of discourses that I think to the average person is alienating. Not to excuse xenophobia or like racial epithets or things of that nature, but just this kind of sense of like being overly sensitive to every single word and making sure that you're using all the right words. I think that does throw a lot of people off outside of sort of a college campus bubble. So
Well,
that's
this,
really one thing I've
this,
noted.
I don't know if you guys saw this. This is kind of floating around right now in the States, but the Democrats have apparently, I didn't do any reporting on this, so I'm just telling you what I've read. But apparently the Democrats are trying in their effort to be to win over working class men, particularly, have launched or proposed a project called Project Sam, called Speaking with American Men, in an effort to sort of change their to better to improve their standing with American guys. And it's come in for some derision, but I think it does point to this really big question, which is, and this gets back to the culture issue. Is there a way that the Democratic Party can speak to working class people in a way that's not calculated, that's not that doesn't kind of run afoul of the values of the Democratic Party? Is there a language for that? Some people just come out of the box just speaking a language. Some politicians are just born with this sort of gift, and I think Bill Clinton, despite his many faults, won election to the presidency twice because he had some kind of magic formula from a political perspective. Policy perspective is sort of another question, but I think he had this ability to sort of fuse a language, a language built of many things. This is a guy who went to some of the best universities in the world, but he did, in fact, grow up poor in rural Arkansas. And, he was able to kind of understand how to describe, an increasingly complex world that requires, advanced college degrees to even get, in a language that many working people could understand. But it's a huge challenge for the Democrats. I don't. I'm glad I'm not. It's not my job to figure out how to fix
Yeah.
that for them. Whoever does, God bless them. It's going to be tough.
But do you think even with like Bill Clinton, for example, and like because Bill Clinton and Tony Blair were sort of the main figures of sort of the third way ideology, which I'm
Yeah,
sure you've heard of.
yeah,
Do you think Trump is in some ways a reaction to feeling sort of sold out in that you had like a Labor government in the UK and you had Bill Clinton and they were putting forward that that way of speaking that did speak to a working class that increasingly wanted to get into the middle class and have children that went to college and so on and so forth. But then that didn't happen because you have at the same time, like, I mean, Clinton does things like sets the stage for NAFTA, which definitely got rid of a lot of good jobs like in America, and did things like repeal Glass-Steagall, which sort of set the part of the lane for like the 2008 financial crisis. I
yeah.
mean, do you think there's a sense of like, okay, you kind of sold us out from the Democrats, and that this not this 90s sort of like end of history liberal dream was sort of a false premise, and
Well,
really you were just sort of helping like a small section of American society, which is sort of democratic elites.
well, I think
How sort of you?
this is like the best question because one is because the some of the well, first of all, I mean, I think it's as someone who's thank God I'm not paid to sort of to it's out of my lane to really tell you definitively whether or not it was NAFTA that tanked American manufacturing, and whether it was NAFTA that really, led to sort of the end of the American working class and American manufacturing. I think a lot of that stuff was happening before NAFTA. I think there were sock factories and pants factories and shirt factories that were already moving their production overseas, if not to Mexico, then to Asia and to other parts of the world. And I think there's so many contradictory data points about whether or not NAFTA helped the U.S. I think it's quite a mixed bag. What I find interesting is the fact that it felt like a big leap for a Bill Clinton and for the Democrats to get behind the idea of NAFTA and of other globalizing policies. Because the Democrats had long been the party of labor unions, who had, of course, long been opposed to this kind of policy. But the Republicans were always gung ho for it, at least until Trumpism.
Of course.
And so I find it really funny. The poor Democrats, it wasn't Nancy Pelosi who decided that everybody needed to sort of rethink their pronouns. This is something that bubbled up from from in a grassroots perspective, and now suddenly the Democrats, in some ways I feel for them, like they're being forced to sort of like carry water for this idea or defend this idea or whatever, because they're the party of traditionally of people who are oppressed, certainly for gay rights more than the Republicans or and all the attendant sort of rights. And yet they're the ones getting hammered for that, and they're sort of the ones who've gotten hammered for supporting globalism, even though I think I mean I don't speak for the Democratic Party at all. I wouldn't want to, but I mean I think there are probably people from that era of the '90s who would say, well, yeah, we were the ones who were fighting for the globalism and fighting for job retraining and fighting for other ways to ameliorate the toughest effects of globalization, and yet we're the ones getting our asses kicked for it under Trumpism, and I find that to be another one of 1,000 really nasty traps that the Democrats find themselves in right now. Their ankles are caught in them, and they don't know how to get themselves out.
But also somewhat self-imposed, right? Like I would just say, with Bill Clinton again, and third way ideology, a big part of that was attempting to sort of not be as interventionist as New Dealism, and sort of, social democracy, but with a more free market approach. And so you saw things like welfare go to being workfare, right?
Sure.
I mean, that seems like a concession to a Republican sort of frame, right? Instead of we're going to give welfare to those who are the most needy in our society, we're going to instead make them work in order to get that welfare and do austerity spending and cut social programs. I mean, that seems like a concession they sort of set for themselves. They sort of set the rake down in front of them and step right on it.
Oh, indeed. But I mean, and again, I mean, not to be, I don't want to be seen as some apologist for Clintonism, but just for sake of the conversation, as somebody who lived through that period, particularly the 1980s. Yeah, no, totally.
I was born after Clinton.
Listen, let me tell you, young man.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, what good does it do to hold on to your ideals in a democracy of, with 300 million people in a country if you're not running the show? I mean, it's good. You can sleep at night, and there's really something to that. Sticking to your guns. But I think that the triangulation, to me at least, it seems. I'm not an expert on this, but it seems to me that the triangulation was an effort to just, get your hands on the controls. It was in response to popular sentiment at the time that, and some of this kind of gets back to media, right? I think in the United States, we had a conservative media that really didn't start elbowing its way into the public consciousness until, I'd like to know when Rush Limbaugh went on the air,
Yeah,
but it's
Rush
probably around
Limbaugh
the
is what I
time
was
of
thinking.
Clintonism, and just extremely popular. Pre-internet, he's
Right.
on every working class person's radio, a lot of working middle class salesperson's radio. I mean,
Hmm.
they had these special Rush rooms where you could go to lunch in the middle of the United States and you could listen to Rush Limbaugh all the time.
Right.
We had the birth of Fox News.
Right.
We also had we had 8 years of Ronald Reagan, who was a very popular president, and this idea of sticking to an old well, I just think that the Democrats like looked at the reality on the ground and looked at the way people felt at the time, and my guess is that they just thought, well, we need to do something. We need to find a way to thread the needle. There are still a lot of working people here in this country. There's still who are worried about Social Security. They want a social safety net, but there's we saw the decline of Detroit, just to offer one example, and the decline of automaking culture there. And there was a real sentiment that the unions had overplayed their hand, that they'd become greedy and sclerotic, and that they were not able to help American manufacturing respond to the reality that really good cars were being made in Japan and then later would be made in Korea. So I don't know. I just that's the only like sort of counter note I would add to that, which is that rightly or wrongly, I think they were just responding to like Clinton particularly was just responding to the vibe on the ground, and I don't think he could have won as an old school labor Democrat.
Mm. Whereas now we're seeing, I mean, with the Bernie Sanders movement, it seems like there is a renewed sort of interest in that style. But I'm cognizant of time. We're at 46 minutes, so I'll give Michaela sort of a final question, and then we'll hopefully
Yeah,
wrap it up.
just kind of bringing it back to our I know we were talking a lot about how Trump and like the MAGA movement, we do see them being a product of social media or like heavily entwined with it. So just as like a little conclusion, I wanted to get your opinion on if we could see any capacity of depolarization in American politics with this context, or are the sort of algorithmic involvement in politics, is that just too deep at this point?
Oh, this is such a great question. I mean, I wonder if, one possibility is that Donald Trump's economic policies prove to be wildly successful in the short term, because everything's short. It has to be short term for him, unless he finds a way to become president beyond the next 3 years, which is worth discussing because he's been discussing it. But if you sort of think, okay, well, this stuff's got to work now. And if it doesn't work now, there will be discontent because he's also sort of promised the moon. And then it's like, I mean, what's the metaphor? You're sort of sitting in your house, you're on your phone and you're on your phone and you think, okay, all right, this is true, this is true, this is true. The algorithm is just feeding people who think that this is what reality is. Well, then suddenly a huge brick comes through your window, which says, you've been laid off, or you can't afford the groceries that you wanted to have, or you can't afford to go on vacation, or something I wrote about recently. You're a little tourist town at the beach in South Carolina, and the Canadians are saying they're not coming anymore because they're a little bit.
Yeah.
They're mildly displeased, I guess it would be the nice way to put it. The very Canadian way to put it, if I'm going to indulge in a stereotype. And then I think there's potentially a reckoning. I mean, I think this is not just contained, not just something to think about when it comes to Trumpism, but any there's the online world, and which I think is where most people are getting most of their information these days. And I am really concerned about the polarization. I don't see any way it's going to be getting any better. But then you do have meat space. You do have to sort of feed your body. You do have to get vitamins and carbohydrates and all these things that keep you as a living, breathing organism. And if that becomes threatened, then perhaps this triggers a change. And I mean, I would say the same thing for the Democrats, and perhaps the Democrats, are and the left is. I mean, everyone's susceptible to the same kind of blindness. If you're not actively seeking out, counter narratives and people pushing against your beautiful ideas, it's very, very possible you could wake up one day and just be shocked by the fact that reality doesn't comport with what your comrades are telling you that reality is. And we've seen that happen quite a bit, with the dawn of, radio, I don't know, going back as far as probably to the history of, newspapers. So I don't know if that really precisely answers the question, but I think that's one possibility. I mean, I think there's another darker possibility, which is that if we head into a crisis globally or in this country, in the West and Canada, and people maintain these very, very strong incentives to only seek out and only be served up media that comport with their view of the world, that countries won't be and societies won't be equipped to really engage properly in this kind of classical liberal ideal, whatever you think of it. I mean, I think it's how most of the world works now. This idea that you get to say whatever you want, and that the better ideas will beat out the less good ideas. And I mean, if you're not even hearing what the ideas are, then I mean, how does that even work? I'm
Yeah.
really not sure.
Well, and then there's this middle circle, I feel like, in terms of who owns the means to, like, platforming certain ideas, and there you just have people like Musk. And so it's already like an uneven playing field for whose ideas get play, because obviously I feel like it's in his direct benefit to put forward ideas that are going to continue to entrench his power.
Yeah, I think this is just a great question too, which is what does a truly democratized marketplace of ideas look like in
Yeah.
this particular moment where it is these platforms that a lot of people turn to even understand what the debate is. I don't pine for the golden days before the internet of newspapers. I mean, it was a lot better for people in my business. There was the economic model was a lot more stable, but I don't know whether that was. I mean, I think there were huge flaws, obviously, in the question of whether or not the richest guy in town owns the printing plant, and he's going to tell you what the news is every day. That's a pretty grim, way of thinking about,
Right.
democratization of ideas. It strikes me as quite limited. But do we really have a true democratization of ideas now? When you think about Twitter, et cetera, I really don't know. I'm
And
not sure.
we will leave listeners to think about that deep question as we approach 53 minutes. Richard, thank you so much for
Thank you so
talking with
much.
us, and sorry for keeping you over the
Oh
time
no, it
we
was a
added.
pleasure. It was great talking to you guys.
Yeah. Awesome.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.